Alan Joyce, welcome to The Business.
Good to talk to you again, Alicia.
I'm guessing you're not quite where you were hoping to be at the full year result.
No, I mean, we thought that at this stage that we would have had the full domestic operation back and be ahead of pre-COVID levels. But unfortunately, the Delta variant has knocked us for six, as it has the country, and getting a lockdown in New South Wales and Victoria and Canberra has put our network significantly below where we thought it would be. But on the upside, the rollout of the vaccine is now gathering pace, and we're optimistic with the four-phase approach that the National Cabinet has actually approved, that we could see domestic borders opening up again in December, early December, and international opening up once we get to 80%, which we believe could happen before Christmas.
Well, let's look at international. You've reiterated December this year is doable, and you've flagged destinations such as the UK, LA and Singapore to start. How will international travel work? The IATA travel passports, vaccination, what are the checks and balances?
Well, first of all, we've obviously had a lot of dialogue with the federal government, and while nobody has a crystal ball of how this could develop, the principles that we've assumed here, the government thinks it's sensible, and I think a number of government ministers have said that today. So our first principle was we think countries with the same level of vaccination, the 70 to 80% that Australia will have by the end of the year, will be those tier one countries that we could open up to, which, as you mentioned, are Canada, the UK, the west coast of the United States, Singapore, Fiji, New Zealand. The second criteria is going to, depending on how much schedule we put in, is the quarantine requirements. And the government is doing some trials, one in South Australia, to what vaccinated people might expect when they travel internationally. And we're hoping that its minimum level of hotel quarantine, no hotel quarantine. If it's 14 days still at that stage, we won't have an international operation. But if it's home quarantine until you have a negative test, which is the way a lot of other countries are doing it, we think you could see international really opening up. And then it's getting ready technology-wise, which is the IATA travel pass, so people can load their vaccination status, because it will be a requirement to travel internationally. A lot of countries are saying it will be a requirement for entry. It will be a requirement to travel on Qantas internationally, and we'll be checking for that status. And the government will have to define which vaccines are acceptable. The TGA will probably list the vaccines that are acceptable into Australia, and then we'll have to ensure that passengers meet those requirements like they meet the visa entry requirements into this country.
Well, obviously a lot of work is going into this. How often are you talking with the government, and how much instruction have you offered Canberra?
So we're continuously talking to the government, literally every day, multiple times a day. And we, as I said, we have bounced this off them. We've said, what do you think of the logic here? That those markets could happen before Christmas, and that other markets where the vaccination levels are very low, like Jakarta, Bali, Manila, Thailand, are going to happen at the earliest April. And the government, as I said, think that's a sensible approach, but have said to us, and we continue to talk to them, a lot depends on what these testing of home quarantine look like and what it means for quarantine post that date. But we're optimistic we'll get there. We may have to vary those dates around a little bit, but this is a sensible assumption. And I should say that for us, the planning involved is quite significant. We have to train people, get aircraft ready months in advance, and we have to have the slots to operate into airports. So we're obviously going to take a more optimistic view with the slots into London and LA. We think it's realistic as well, because if you give back the slots, you wouldn't be able to operate pre-Christmas, and that's why it was important to consult the government and make sure what we're saying has some chance of happening, which they believe it does.
You're looking at destinations with comparable vaccination rates to Australia. Are cheap holidays to the likes of Southeast Asia off the cards for now?
I think there's going to be, we're assuming, as I said, that won't be until April at the earliest to a lot of those destinations. But there will be some very attractive airfares to the UK and the US. We'll be trying to get our aircraft back in the air, get our people back to work, and we'll be trying to just cover cash costs, so it's not the profitability that we had before, because the important thing for us is to get our people back to work. And already you can see airfares to the UK selling for less than $2,000, $1,800 in January, which is in some cases peak season, and the US $1,400. And we think there'll be a lot of fare promotions. There will also be a lot of frequent flyer seats. We have a lot of people that have built up frequent flyer points during the COVID lockdowns by earning the points on the ground. And our intention, like domestic, is to make a lot more seats available for people to use their frequent flyer points.
Are you worried about consumer hesitancy in terms of getting on planes? You have offered a lot of rewards to those who are vaccinated.
Yes, I think we see in the research huge pent-up demand. So we survey every month people's intention to travel internationally. And as we see light at the end of the tunnel, we actually are seeing that level 3 times what it normally is. And it's probably not a surprise. 50% of Australians were either born overseas or have a relative overseas. And we launched our advertising campaign talking about the positives of getting vaccination. People travel for weddings, people traveling to see family, people traveling for holidays. And that got an amazing emotional reaction, and it went viral in this country. So we know that people and the opinion of the public is turning for a way out of this pandemic, is turning to have hope that once we get to 80%, we'll see the borders opening up. And we know people will be very keen to get on an aircraft in the first year. I know my mother lives in Ireland. I haven't seen her for 2 years. As soon as I can, I want to get on an aircraft and go there. And there are millions of Australians that will be in the same boat.
Well, you said that it would be a terrible shame if by Christmas you could travel to London but not to Perth. How much of a risk is it that might be the case?
Well, we hope it's not. I think the Prime Minister is doing a fantastic job at promoting the National Cabinet consensus. And the National Cabinet consensus was that 70% will open up the domestic borders and we shouldn't see those borders closing again. And at 80%, we start opening up international. All the premiers have agreed to that. All the premiers should stick to that agreement. And the Doherty Institute said this week, it doesn't matter what the starting point is, and they've clarified it, which was some of the concerns of some of the premiers. So we hope that they will stick to that. If they don't, I think there's going to be a public backlash against this, because it would be terrible, outrageous, disappointing if you could go and see relatives in the UK for Christmas, but you can't see your relatives in Perth. That is not what a national Australia will want. That's not what the population will want. And I think there will be a backlash to the politicians that would insist that would occur when they signed up to a plan that we're likely to achieve before Christmas.
How much of a hit to your revenue, though, would there be if we do see the Queensland and WA borders closed, even if international is able to open up?
So, I mean, we don't think that will happen, because we actually do think people will stick to the National Cabinet rules that are there. But what we have shown is that we can manage this environment very effectively. We've shown that borders do cost us a lot of money if they close down, but we can ramp up and ramp down, and we have the flexibility to do that. 94% of Qantas's flights last year were cash positive, so we don't burn a huge amount of cash when we're managing it. But I think the economy can't keep on going in lockdown. Continuous lockdown, continuous border closures are having real impacts on people's health, mental health, the economic health of businesses, which leads to other health issues and can lead to a recession and can lead to businesses failing. And we need to make sure that we have a way out of this. We have a National Cabinet approach to get out of it. We expect everybody to honour it. And there are significant consequences if we keep on staying in lockdown. And I think the population is frankly fed up with it. They want a way out, and they want the leaders to show a way out and have leadership and commit to that way out of this issue.
In this result, There was an obvious reliance on cost cutting, your debt facilities and federal government support. Qantas received $1 billion from the federal government this reporting period. Without that money, what would the airline look like?
Well, the $1 billion, there's a lot of misreporting on the $1 billion from the government. The $1 billion had two components of it. There was $600 million that was in JobKeeper or wage support that went to our people. Because we at one stage had 22,000 people stood down, and the only money they had coming in was JobKeeper or these support packages that have come out recently. We have 8,500 people currently stood down that are dependent on those packages. And the other 400 million was around fee for services. We, on behalf of the government, have put on 320 repatriation flights that the government is paying us for, because we incur fuel, we incur aircraft costs, and we have to pay people. And that's brought back 26,000 Australians. That money hasn't gone to our bottom line. It's paid for those aircraft to do that. And we also put on 1,800 flights for freight. That's kept 120,000 jobs alive in Australia in agriculture and fisheries. We did that again, hasn't gone to our bottom line. It's actually covered the cost of those freighters. In some cases, passenger aircraft that have travelled empty with no passengers but have had freight in the belly hold to keep those industries alive. That's not a bailout from the government. That's Qantas being paid by the government to help other industries, and that's the way it should have been. Where we've helped ourselves is where most of this has come from. We've actually raised $2.8 billion in extra debt, and from our shareholders we've raised $1.4 billion in equity to allow us to do the restructuring. That's how Qantas is getting through this, by helping itself, and we're happy to help the federal government with these programs, and we're happy the federal government is helping our people, and given that they've closed the borders down and states have closed the borders down, we think our people should be given some help.
On people, how many staff do you have post this pandemic hit versus how many you had beforehand, in terms of how many have you had to let go?
We've had to let go 9,400 people, so we've come down from around 32,000 employees to 22,000 employees. And we're hopeful that once we get through this pandemic, that once we get domestic up and running and international up and running, that we could see some growth. Back in 2013, we had to let 5,000 people go because the company was in trouble. But in subsequent years, we recruited all those back.
Alan Joyce, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Alicia. Appreciate your time.